Well, let's start. Let's start as folks are coming in because we've got about 30 minutes. So again, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk today about persistent and intergenerational racial and wealth and gender wealth gaps. These have come into sharp focus, especially in our country during the pandemic, and the implications of this persistent material wealth gap are far-reaching beyond sort of what immediately comes to mind in terms of its implications on access to education, on health outcomes, on our ability as individuals and communities to endure economic downturns and other temporary and less temporary setbacks. My name is Manmeet Mehta. I'm with the Ashoka team. And today we are privileged to be joined by Ashoka fellow Chloe McKenzie. I'm going to talk to Chloe about her strategies and how we address this wealth gap for Black women and for women of color in the US. She's going to share insights, she's going to share perspectives on her work that she's been doing for a number of years. And really, really powerfully, we're going to hear from Chloe on how she's changing the language around race and gender wealth disparities and why that's so important. So again, thanks, Chloe. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Some quick housekeeping notes before we start. Please continue to add your comments, your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to get to those right at the end. We're going to talk about 20-25 minutes and then leave about 5 to 7 minutes in the end for questions. And we'll try to get them all. So now, with only 30 minutes, let's just dive in. Chloe, let's begin with an idea that's central to your work. You say that you are not a proponent of financial literacy. Can you elaborate on that?
I can. And that's oftentimes what shocks people at first, because I think when people read about my work, it's very easy to put me into that box. But yes, I am very much not a proponent of financial literacy for a couple of reasons. I know we'll go more into this. The first is because financial literacy by default is in a very effective vehicle for transmitting or perpetrating financial trauma. And financial trauma in and of itself is going to have a negative impact on a person's wealth building capability. And the reason why that is because financial trauma, and I wrote a fact sheet on this, it does a couple of things, namely that the embedded legacies of white supremacy are just rife throughout the conceptual frameworks of financial literacy, and more importantly, the narratives that are made available through financial literacy concepts and lessons and things like that, that ultimately structure our relationships with money and wealth. And then the final kind of piece, which again, I know we'll elaborate on more so, but financial literacy ultimately does two things. It oftentimes is rooted in financial shaming. So in many ways, it is blaming the socioeconomic harm that we experience on the person who is experiencing the harm. And then it also then in many ways condones or normalizes economic violence, which is the harm that we are experiencing from a socioeconomic perspective, but then somehow, kind of legitimates the way that our economic system actually thwarts or thrusts traumatizing events, adverse financial experiences, et cetera, on us.
So let's pause for a minute on these terms. You talked about financial trauma, where you're emphasizing that it's not so much the individual decisions that are the focus, that are currently the focus of financial literacy programming and are often denying or ignoring the extent of the impact that systems of oppression have created on a person's financial scenario. Now, you've also coined the term wealth justice. And I want to dig a little deeper on why you think this new language for wealth is important. How does it propel us forward?
Absolutely. So what I've done in my research on financial trauma is I've tried to unpack or really highlight and prioritize this concept that wealth and trauma are inextricably linked, particularly in the Western context and even more focused in the American context. So this is largely true across the world, but I'm specifically looking at America and Black women's kind of unique struggle against wealth inequality. And the idea is if we go all the way back to the inception of our economic system, each group, regardless if you were enslaved, or the person who was benefiting from slavery, had an economic imperative that was codified based on our political systems and our economic system. And for Black women specifically, especially after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, our economic imperative was to birth all of the wealth in the American context, which ultimately says that Black women's bodies, or our biology, are distinctly or not separable from this idea of our economic output. In many ways, that kind of imperative has remained largely the same even today. And what that ultimately does mean is that Black women are required to experience some form of violence that has an economic implication to it, in order to then be able to have any type of experience of some type of that's related to finance, for example. And the cumulative effect of that is so traumatizing that we know just from trauma theory more broadly that trauma completely reorders the way that our body functions, that our minds function. And I argue that financial trauma, which is this cumulative harm that we experience, whether historically, intergenerationally, or just contemporarily, it is going to be embodied within us and then show up in our financial behavior. So to your point about financial literacy, why I find it so damaging and problematic is it continues to assume that our socioeconomic positioning is not something that is structural, but more behavioral, when really even though our financial behavior is somewhat of an individualized experience, it is often colored by our traumatic experiences. So, which is linked to the structural positioning of our economic imperatives. So that's essentially how financial trauma works. And wealth justice is really just this overwhelming commitment to healing financial trauma, which has the largest influence on a person's wealth building capability, and then actually placing the blame back where it belongs, so that we're not carrying this blame and shame that's associated with our traumatization.
That is a really powerful reframe on one of the most urgent challenges that confronts us, and particularly because it's completely reframing the lens through which we are building solutions here. And so, with these deep insights and this perspective, you're bringing these to life through your organization, Black Femme.
Yes.
And you're focusing on ecosystems where the financial trauma starts to shape mindsets, where it starts to take root, and you're reinforcing a wealth mindset. And through that, you are taking an intergenerational approach in shifting these inequities. And to be more specific, you're beginning with education systems. So you're working in 20 plus school districts in 38 cities. What does this curriculum look like in these scenarios?
Yes, and I'll even start by dovetailing off of what you just said. So not only is it a powerful and dangerous restructuring and reframing of the narrative, but it's also completely antithetical to the American economic opportunity consensual narrative that we tend to, consume just being in America. So yes, you're correct. There are mainly four of the ripest contexts for financial trauma to be perpetrated or transmitted happen to be education systems, policymaking systems, culture systems, and family systems. And so I started Black Femme really focusing on the education systems, particularly the K-12 system, because I thought that, one, we know that early intervention works from a social change perspective, and from a financial trauma perspective, the younger that you start, the less traumatized people have become because of our economic system. So they may be exposed to the traumatization that their parents or elders or grownups may have experienced around them, but the actual hold on how financial trauma has become embodied in their financial behavior is much less than when you start with adults. That was kind of the idea behind it. But our curricula, just in general, whether it's financial or otherwise, again, is a narrative that then is made available to us. It gets internalized, and then it structures our relationship with money and wealth. And so if we are refusing to kind of intercept or intervene in the availability of narratives that could produce financial trauma, that could produce financial shame, we need to have some type of intervention. And that's ultimately what Black Femme started to do, which was going into some of the most under-resourced and purposely ignored populations, school districts, implementing our wealth justice framework 5 days a week as a core subject, beginning in pre-K, going through 12, having family related programming, and then actually training the school system on how to not perpetrate said trauma through their curricular frameworks. And now that's broadened itself. Black Femme has, and it's whatever iteration it's in now, has increased to the higher education pillar. So you have all the education systems, policymaking systems, cultural systems, and family systems.
That's a really powerful frame. And how are you working with cities and policymakers specifically in this work?
Yes, so it's interesting because going from just education systems and then kind of going up to the next tier was very organic. It's not something that I consciously thought of as a kind of business model, but it became that when my research around financial trauma gained more visibility, and I looked and people started to understand like which of those ripe contexts do I fit in. That's when cities were starting to say, we have a residents population that is probably experiencing financial trauma for XYZ reasons. Maybe you live in the South, which is historically, rife with financial traumatization, et cetera. And we want to close the wealth gap. And so we'd like to use your framework to do so. And policy is one of, again, the major drivers of financial trauma, because policy is where we codify those very dangerous and damaging economic imperatives that then ultimately have a unique impact on certain people's struggle against wealth inequality. So mayors and state officials are now reaching out saying, okay, how can we develop an entire infrastructure that I agree with, which says we will do direct services to our target population, which is important. But if we also then don't change all of the ecosystems that inform or influence the entire conditions of the lives of the people we're trying to help, then we're ultimately limiting our impact. So to maximize that, you need to do the kind of direct impact with the target constituency. That's the healing work, if you will. And then you need to do the ecosystems change, which are all of those contexts needs to be reformed in such a way that it can maximize wealth building capability and help people restore or secure what I call material safety.
Yeah, and I wonder if COVID has accelerated or posed more of a challenge to this work.
What's interesting is COVID, I think, drove this very crazy demand for this work. I think COVID, on top of what happened last summer with kind of the reckoning that we're having around racism and other forms of oppression in the country, have definitely exacerbated that. COVID and it's the economic devastation because of it, right? With the she-cession and all of these kind of different negative externalities because of the pandemic, and frankly, our country's lack of readiness to be able to meet the challenge, have all kind of created this incredible demand for us to think about this differently. And that's been kind of an interesting thing, because even pre-COVID and when Black Femme was specifically focused on education systems, what was interesting was I specifically knew that it made sense to go to failing school systems first. Not just because they're under-resourced, so a business person would be like, that doesn't make any sense. But the reason why I did that is because they are more open to this radical shift, I think, than others. And so what COVID has done is it has highlighted that the way that we talk about wealth inequality has been inadequate and has not captured the multi-layered texture adequately enough around people's unique struggle around wealth inequality. And frankly, our solutions have not been adequate enough, because we are continuing to see disparities even intraracially when we look at things from an intersectional perspective.
Yeah. And I wonder, and if you'll allow me, we pivot a little bit, and I wonder if you connect the dots for us here with your personal story, and how that got you to a point where you started Black Femme at a really challenging moment. So yeah, if you'll allow that, let's pivot to you.
And I always appreciate this question because, I ultimately end up telling people I came up with the concept of financial trauma theory through self-exploration. And I didn't think that at the time, but now I realize it is so deeply personal, which is helping inform a lot of the work that I'm doing. So I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland. It is one of only 7 counties where Black families have more wealth than white families. So a very different experience than some of my Black friends from college who grew up not in kind of locations that look like that or have those types of experiences. At the same time, I've been on my own since I was 12, largely because I grew up in a very abusive household. I was kind of the golden child, Matilda-like character in my own life, where at 12, because I'm a self-proclaimed nerd, I was a freshman in high school. And so one of the things that I started to realize to myself years later was the first kind of time where I realized that my trauma and my family's financial privilege had a relationship was when my parents were getting a divorce. I had read in a law book at 10 years old that if there's a divorce proceeding in a particular state, you could request time with the judge and get things put into the divorce settlement. And so I got my college and my siblings' college paid for as a part that would become legally binding. So that set me up. To be honest with you, if that did not happen at 12, I probably wouldn't have started Black Femme because I would have had student loans, even though I had gone to Wall Street, kind of all these different things. So what I ultimately realized is after sustaining such physical and other forms of abuse at home, it also colored my relationship with money. So after I kind of got a couple of years into Black Femme, and I started to rhetorically interrogate kind of the model, rhetorically interrogate just financial education as a whole and what impact it's actually having on wealth building capability, I started to ask myself, like, well, I was experiencing some form of imposter syndrome a little bit because I was like, you have one of the most contentious relationships with money, Chloe. So what is that about? And how does that play into some of the solutions that you're coming up with? And you're also then dealing with like the petulance related to how academic studies around the wealth gap are so one-dimensional and don't have this multi-layered texture and things like that, even with my experience. So I asked myself, to what extent does this relationship between experiencing trauma and wealth building, or this pursuit of financial security, or whatever you want to call it, influence your financial behavior? And that question was a question to myself that I directed to myself and did a lot of self-reflecting on, and then kind of broadened that after taking in narratives from other Black women and their unique socioeconomic experiences.
Wow. And so you started Black Femme.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a story behind that name? Why did you in particular choose that name? Why is it powerful to start with this particular audience?
Yes, there are 2 answers to this. I'll start with the less serious, a little more funny one. So, I was a trader on Wall Street before I started Black Femme. And so I was like, oh, Black Femme, this is a great name, like BlackRock, Blackstone, Black Femme, right? So it kind of fits in with this whole financial institution kind of naming or whatever. The real reason that I did it was because, again, my large frustration, and this still exists today, is that the way we understand wealth inequality or even talk about it in this country is usually from one dimension. We usually say the racial wealth gap, which I always encourage people to recognize the danger of how that might render Black women and women of color invisible. because you're only talking about it from a racial perspective. The reason why I use this, a little anecdotal piece of evidence, is like the intra-racial wealth gap for Black people. For every dollar a single Black man owns, a Black woman only owns 42 cents. For every dollar a single Hispanic man owns, a Hispanic woman owns nothing. So it's not to say that the wealth gap is not severely hurting just people of color in general, but when we look at it across race and gender, it is much more severe and intractable for people who have occupied multiple vulnerable identities, usually across race, gender, class, et cetera, and sexuality. So that's kind of the one side. And then Black feminist tradition. So I remember reading my senior year of college, the Combahee River Collective statement. If you haven't read it, it's like required reading at, with my team, and we read it often. But the Combahee River Collective essentially stated that Black feminism is the way that we're going to solve our social problems, because if we actually are liberating those who are situated at the bottom of our proverbial socio-political and economic totem pole, we're liberating everybody. So Black Femme is derived from Black feminist thinking and thought and action. And so I just took the two words together and made them together. And then again, going like overly poetic here, but Black Femme is one word for me because I can't just be Black in one moment and a female in the other. It's both intersectional, so they cannot be delinked. So that's kind of the meaning behind the name.
And in lifting this community, we're lifting so many other aspects of our community, and that is really powerful. We've got a couple of questions, Chloe. Maybe we dive into it, and then I have a couple more before we wrap. I have a question from Marina. Marina is curious to hear more about the process of healing this multi-generational trauma, and if you have any examples of the process of healing. Is everyone aware that they have trauma, or are they learning about it through the program while then also beginning to work on healing this legacy?
I would say 90% of the time people are learning that they have, or I think they know that they are experiencing financial trauma, but they've never had the language for it. And this is part of actually the first step of healing, right? So if you, again, understand trauma more broadly, the first thing that we ask of survivors is to be able to name and kind of articulate their experience. And until now, one, our socioeconomic experiences, just because culturally we have been socialized to say the socioeconomic harm you experience is your fault because you weren't financially savvy, or whatever the kind of reason is, which creates shame. And we've never had language to be able to say that if I am a worker who has to go through really disgusting workplace conditions and I am underpaid, that's actually a traumatic event. Nobody's even calling that traumatic. They're calling it like unfortunate. They may call it unethical, but we're not even using that type of language. So that's kind of the first part, is having the language to be able to contextualize your experience is the part of the process of healing. To try to go deeper into that would be very complicated, one, but two, that's actually what I'm studying. So I have looked at ways that people can develop what I'm calling post-traumatic financial resilience, but that's going to be in 2022 research land. So hope that you'll kind of follow along. But I would say the first step in healing financial trauma is being able to name it, and then have the correct language to then help you contextualize it and shift the blame off of yourself, because a lot of our economic imperatives are not because of our individual behavior. It's because of something much larger, more damaging and structural.
And on that, what is the reaction of people when you sort of propose the notion of trauma and financial violence to them, in their openness to accepting that about their experience?
That is a wonderful question. And you can imagine it is a very mixed bag. I would say overwhelmingly, even those who become triggered by the word, because it is a triggering word, and I'm very aware of that. I'm also aware that my lexicon of wealth justice is a derivative of the language of harm, which can be a lot for people to digest. But I think that when people take a moment to reflect on it, they actually realize that it's the right language. So there's almost this layer of relief that it's like I finally have the words that I needed to be able to capture my experience. It's also interesting when I then work with institutions who no longer want to perpetrate financial trauma. That from, I joke about it sometimes, but it's a dangerous lexicon. But I do that on purpose. So Audre Lorde talked about women are powerful and dangerous. And I use this phrase to think about the work that I do, that in order for us to shift this paradigm, the work has to be dangerous and powerful. And so the danger of using this lexicon is now what institutions who are perpetrating or transmitting the trauma have to recognize is they are actually causing harm. And so like lawyers might freak out, like, okay, are we really going to say that our college institution is causing economic harm to our students? It's like, yeah, that's what we have to do because that's ultimately the effect. So largely it is a sense of relief. There's a little bit of fear, but then equally it's also kind of like it usually is disorienting in many ways, which again is a natural kind of response when you begin to use the right language to contextualize your experience.
And that itself is a process and an experiential journey that's woven into how you operate your programming. There's a related question, and you talked about institutions that have in the past been part of a system that creates this. There's a question that says, does your organization partner with corporate sponsors and in what capacity? So I want to broaden that a little bit to say, what is your approach and partnership and working and collaborating to address some of these deeper challenges?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Black Femme is kind of its own project that I manage, and then I have an ecosystem of a bunch of other things that I do. So Chloe McKenzie partners with institutions who, let's just kind of call it what it is. I get inquiries lots of times that are saying, I have a feeling or a hunch that this funding process or this grant making process, or even just like our business model at large, might be contributing to the wealth gap or might be contributing to the financial traumatization of underserved and purposely ignored populations. Can you help us understand what we need to do in order to kind of roll back that effect and create one that actually creates a net positive for the communities that we care about? And so that's what I've kind of done with financial institutions, higher education institutions, local, state, and federal governments, policymaking institutions, you kind of name it, research institutions. And so what I do is I both kind of understand that whether it's intentional or otherwise is not really the question of my work, but to what extent does, again, the way that we have conceptualized our economic system and these economic imperatives that are frankly very oppressive and damaging, how does that actually then get embedded into business models or institutional frameworks? And how can we actually weed those out and do some of the kind of systemic or institutional transformation that's necessary so that effect no longer happens?
And do you feel like you're beginning to engage in that way with organizations?
That's actually been the largest part of my work in 2021. So again, I think this like huge collision between COVID and the economic devastation of everything, coupled with the kind of racial reckoning that we've been having. Then towards the end of 2020, the gender reckoning and sexual-based reckoning with the She Session, I think businesses are starting to understand that, like, yes, we can make these commitments, but these commitments could ultimately be canceled out even if we are pledging funding or whatever, because our model, our business model, our institutional frameworks and function ultimately create this financially traumatizing effect. And that's one of the things that we need to be able to undo. So even, VC funds have asked me to audit their funding processes, for example, because they're interested in funding founders of color, but don't realize the things that they're asking for in their due diligence processes could actually be a form of financial traumatization that is not intended, but ultimately the effect.
Yeah. So let me ask you this as well then. When you think to the future, you're thinking 6 months down the line, 6 years down the line, you're thinking a generation down the line. How are you thinking about how this shifts, about your impact?
6 months down the line, I'm hoping that the lexicon of wealth justice is more widely applied to the work of people who are trying to achieve wealth justice, economic justice, just social justice more broadly, right? I mean, any form of kind of reformative justice is always going to intersect. So even when you think of climate justice, that is a wealth justice issue in many ways, because we know that people who are experiencing the effects of climate change are usually in lower income neighborhoods. So they're all interconnected. And so again, I think the lexicon is helping us better contextualize the problem. And so if we don't actually place financial trauma in context when we're talking about systemic change, that I don't think we will ever have adequate enough solutions, and frankly, rigorous enough solutions to close the wealth gap. 6 years from now, it's not just that we have now the language, but that again, everything from the four right contexts, right? The way that these ecosystems function are actually responding to and are being accountable to the lexicon and the framework and the conceptualization. So now we're looking at the ways that policymakers are identifying. So I'm creating a measurement tool, for example, that policymakers can say, before this bill, the financial trauma severity was blank. After this tool, it looked like blank. Knowing that financial trauma is the biggest influence on wealth building capability. And 6 generations from now, if I'm being incredibly optimistic on this wonderful Wednesday, the wealth gap ideally would have closed specifically for Black women. But if it didn't close, it got narrower, right? So we're at a point where it's still widening. And part of the reason why I actually believe it's widening is because we have not integrated this conceptualization of financial trauma into the way that we are solving wealth inequality issues.
Well, you give me and all of us listening a lot of hope and optimism on what we can do together. We are at time. I'm going to ask you one question, Chloe. I think it is rather pertinent to some of the other things that have been happening around the world recently. There is a question that says, where can I find a roadmap or a list of resources for refugees looking for wealth justice information, wanting to build wealth for themselves and future generations? Is that a resource that is available on your website somewhere?
The new research that will be coming out between now and the beginning of next year, yes. I'm glad that you brought up refugees, because this is some of the new work that I've been looking at. So I'm working actually on the ground virtually, because it's COVID, with a number of organizations that are working with, for example, like the Afghan refugees who have now come to the country. And so I'm doing a lot of work, again, making sure that the solutions we're providing to those people who have been displaced largely because of economic imperatives from, kind of across the country, we could get into all of this, are done so in a way that continues to honor the traumatic experiences of those who have experienced that, and recognizing what are the economic imperatives we are placing on refugees once again. And again, when we think about this from an immigration perspective, that's another way that we can be thinking about it. The lexicon of wealth justice is deeply embedded into the fabric of our discussions and discourse on immigration as well.
Thank you. That is powerful. We are over time. I have many questions, and we have several more from the audience. But maybe we can pass them along to you and share more in a follow-on email. I think my colleagues are posting that there will be.
That's totally fine. We've got a pretty big group. I mean, I'm happy to keep going. It's up to everybody else. But I will definitely make sure that they're answered. And I know that the Ashoka team will make sure that the answers kind of get out to the world. But if there are people, I mean, there's still a pretty good handful of people on. So up to you, Manmeet, what you want to do.
All right. Well, how about this? Let's have one last question, which is, let you have the last word. Is there something that we haven't talked about that you want us to think about? The one thing that you want us to maybe do or consider as we go about our day in the coming, weeks?
It's so funny, because when you sent me this question, I was like, I'm still thinking about the answer to that question. I think the big thing what is required for healing trauma in general, right, is this kind of deep exploration within about our experiences and how we've ultimately ended up labeling them or creating a cohesive narrative to try to understand them. So one thing that I want to do is, we tend to focus so much on especially as a social entrepreneur, right? Like, how can I help that group? How can I help that person? It's very external. And one of the things that I've realized, to your point about my personal story, is when you flip that and start with yourself and do the self-exploration using the lexicon, how does that change the way that we think about a particular social issue? So one thing that I would, I guess, just encourage is when we're thinking about social issues that we care about, what would it mean for you to start looking at yourself first before we go external? And how might that change the way we choose to be innovative around our solutions? So I'm using that to say that that has worked for me. And I think it's also been a really good way of showing up for the communities that we ultimately want to show up for in a much more authentic way.
Yeah, with empathy and humility. There is one more question, actually, if you don't mind answering one last one. I think this would be a really important one to hear from you on, is that there has been a lot of backlash that has been experienced, especially in the context of education systems, backlash against critical race theory teaching. And how has that affected your work, if at all?
I'll even take it before the CRT debate, and I'm using that term very loosely. So Black Femme was also a very intentional thing. And early on, I would say part of the reason why we are still chronically underfunded is because we prioritize Black women. And there have been a lot of school systems who have asked, can you change your name? If you change your name, you'll get the contract. And I say no. Or why Black girls and like nobody else? And it's not that we only work with Black women and girls. We work with everybody. We disaggregate the data. So we're making sure that we're helping Black women and girls. So with the issue around critical race theory, the answer is no. It's interesting because, again, a lot of the work, especially since late 2020, has been in the South. There hasn't been as much of an interference here. And I think it's just because the people who are coming to us, again, really understand this dynamic between what's dangerous and powerful. And they're willing to kind of accept the danger and power of what it is that we do. In terms of like, theoretically, there are like the people who talk about my model and they're like, financial literacy isn't white supremacist. Like, what are you talking about? And for me, I'm just kind of like, you can debate that somewhere else. I'm not going to talk about that because it's been proven. So in many ways, I think it has, but the overwhelming demand that we have like doesn't even allow us to even go into areas where I think CRT is becoming so controversial. I will say that parents largely who have been concerned about our model in the classroom usually get over it quickly because I guess just like this idea of having greater wealth and things like that seems to overpower the kind of racist undertones of the curricula itself. So that's been quite interesting, but a whole other conversation we can have another day.
Yes. But I am so struck and hopeful at the end of this conversation, more than I was at the beginning. So we're way over time. And so thank you for spending all this extra time with us. Thank you for spending your time at all to begin with today afternoon. Thanks to everyone who stuck around, listened, and we'll be in touch with more. But, again, just a word from Ashoka is that it is completely a privilege to find and to support social entrepreneurs and fellows like Chloe, who are doing such important critical work, and we are grateful for the privilege. And so please look to the chat for information on how you can follow and support their work, and stay in touch with her and stay in touch with us. And we'll be back with more conversations in the coming weeks. So thanks again, Chloe, and thank you everyone who is listening.
Thank you so much.
Bye.